Hello everyone, and welcome to Files of Fear. Tonight, we are entering a world where ordinary places become scenes of unimaginable terror. In this episode, you will hear 8 disturbing horror stories involving the ancient depths of the Appalachian Mountains. These accounts come from people who claim they experienced something they still cannot fully explain, encounters that change the way they look at dark roads, empty rooms, unfamiliar faces, and the strange sounds that appear when everyone else is asleep. Some names, locations, and identifying details may have been changed to protect the people involved, but the events themselves have been preserved as they were described. So before we begin, turn off the lights, lock the doors, and check the darkness behind you. Because once tonight's first story begins, you may not feel alone again. Subscribe to Files of Fear for more disturbing encounters, unexplained mysteries, and true horror stories. Now, let us begin. This happened 3 summers ago when I was 28 years old. I had just finished my master's degree in environmental science at the University of Colorado, and I decided to celebrate by taking a solo hiking trip through the Appalachian Trail. My name is Marcus Rodriguez. I'm from Denver, and I had hiked plenty of challenging terrain in the Rockies. Though I figured the gentle rolling mountains of the East Coast would be a relaxing change of pace, I could not have been more wrong about what waited for me in those ancient hills. I started my hike in Virginia, planning to cover about 50 mi over 5 days through the Blue Ridge Mountains. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. The trail was well marked, the weather was perfect, and I was making good time. I'd been averaging about 12 m per day, stopping to camp at designated sites and enjoying the solitude. The Appalachian wilderness has a different feeling than the Rockies. Where Colorado mountains feel young and sharp, these hills feel ancient and heavy with history. There is something in the air itself that feels thick and watchful. On the 3rd morning, I woke up to find my GPS device completely dead. The battery had been full the night before, and my backup power bank was not working either, which was strange because it was brand new. I still had my paper maps and compass, so I was not too worried. The trail was clearly marked with white blazes painted on trees every few hundred yards. What could go wrong? I'd been hiking for about 2 hours when I met him. I was taking a water break at a small clearing when this guy emerged from the woods like he had been waiting for me. He was probably in his 40s, wearing faded camouflage pants and a torn flannel shirt. He had long, greasy hair tied back in a ponytail, and a thick beard that looked like it had not been trimmed in months. His eyes were this pale, washed-out blue that reminded me of winter sky. "You look lost, friend," he said, even though I was standing right next to a trail marker. I told him I was fine, just taking a break, but he kept talking. He introduced himself as Billy and said he had been living in these mountains his whole life. He knew every trail, every shortcut, every hidden spring and cave. He had this way of talking that was friendly on the surface but felt somehow wrong underneath. Like when someone smiles, but their eyes do not match. Billy told me there was a much better route than the main trail, one that would cut off about 8 miles and take me through some of the most beautiful, untouched parts of the mountains. He said most hikers never got to see the real Appalachian wilderness because they stuck to the tourist trails. He could show me hidden waterfalls, ancient Native American sites, places where the mountain spirit still lived. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to say no. This guy appeared out of nowhere in the middle of thousands of acres of wilderness. He knew I was hiking alone, and he was offering to take me off the marked trail into areas where no one would ever find me if something went wrong. But he seemed so genuinely enthusiastic about sharing his knowledge of the mountains, and I had always prided myself on being adventurous and open to new experiences. Looking back, I think what really convinced me was how well he knew the area. He could describe specific landmarks, tell me the names of peaks I could see in the distance, and even warned me about a section of the main trail that had been washed out by recent storms. When I checked my map, everything he said was accurate. He clearly was a local who knew these mountains inside and out, so I agreed to follow his shortcut. The first hour of hiking with Billy was actually pleasant. He led me off the main trail onto what looked like an old logging road that had been reclaimed by the forest. The path was faint but still visible, winding through dense stands of oak and maple. Billy was a good guide, pointing out edible plants, showing me tracks from deer and bear, telling me stories about the history of the area. He told me about the old mountain families who had lived in these hollows for generations, how they had their own ways of doing things and did not trust outsiders. He talked about the coal mines that had scarred these hills decades ago, and how some of the abandoned shafts were so deep that you could drop a stone and never hear it hit bottom. He mentioned that people still went missing in these mountains every year, mostly city folks who did not understand how easy it was to get turned around once you left the marked trails. As we walked deeper into the wilderness, I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable. We had been hiking for over 2 hours, but we had not seen any of the landmarks Billy had promised. No waterfalls, no ancient sites, just endless forests that all looked the same. When I asked about it, Billy said we were taking a longer route than he had originally planned because of some recent landslides. Then I realized we were not following any kind of trail at all anymore. Billy was just leading me through the woods, weaving between trees, going up and down ridges with no apparent destination. When I stopped and asked to see where we were on my map, Billy laughed and said maps were useless in this part of the mountains because the terrain changed so much with each storm. That was when I noticed we were not alone. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, just glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, the sound of branches snapping somewhere behind us. But as the afternoon wore on, I became certain that at least 2 other people were following us through the woods. Staying just out of sight but matching our pace exactly. I confronted Billy about it and his whole demeanor changed. The friendly mask dropped and his pale eyes went cold and calculating. He said his boys were just making sure we did not run into any trouble, that these mountains could be dangerous for someone who did not know their way around. When I asked what kind of trouble, he smiled and said there were all sorts of predators in these woods, and some of them walked on 2 legs. I told Billy I wanted to go back to the main trail immediately. He laughed and asked if I even knew which direction that was. I looked around and realized he was right. We had been walking for hours through dense forest with no sun visible through the canopy. I had completely lost my sense of direction. Billy told me not to worry, that he and his boys would take good care of me. They had a nice camp set up not too far ahead with hot food and cold beer. I could rest up for the night, and in the morning they would help me find my way back to civilization. The way he said, "Help me find my way back," made my blood run cold. I knew I was in serious trouble. I was alone in the middle of thousands of acres of wilderness, with a man who had deliberately led me away from any marked trails, and there were at least 2 other people stalking us through the woods. My GPS was dead. My phone had no signal, and I had no idea which direction led back to safety. I told Billy I needed to use the bathroom and stepped behind a large oak tree. The moment I was out of his sight, I took off running. I had no plan except to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever Billy and his friends had planned for me. Running through dense forest is nothing like running on trails. Every step is uncertain. Branches whip across your face. Roots catch your feet and you cannot see more than a few yards in any direction. Behind me, I could hear shouting and the sound of multiple people crashing through the underbrush. Billy was calling my name, saying I was being stupid, that I would get lost and die in these woods without his help. I ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. My lungs were burning, my legs were shaking, and I had cuts all over my arms and face from thorns and branches. Finally, I had to stop and catch my breath behind a fallen log. That was when I heard the whistling. It was not like someone whistling a tune. It was a sharp, piercing sound, like a bird call, and it was coming from at least 3 different directions around me. Billy and his friends were communicating with each other, coordinating their search. They knew these woods far better than I did, and they were hunting me like an animal. I forced myself to keep moving, trying to go uphill because I remembered from my map that the main trail followed a ridge line. If I could get high enough, I might be able to see some landmark that would help me figure out where I was. As I climbed, the whistling sounds got fainter, but I could still hear them echoing through the valleys below me. These men were not giving up. They were going to keep looking until they found me. And when they did, I had no doubt that whatever they had planned would not end well for me. Just as the sun was starting to set, I reached the top of a ridge and saw the most beautiful sight of my life. A white blaze painted on a tree about 50 yards away. I had found the Appalachian Trail. I stumbled toward that trail marker like it was salvation itself. Once I was back on the marked trail, I started running again, heading south because I remembered there was a road crossing about 5 mi in that direction. I ran until it was completely dark, using my flashlight to follow the white blazes from tree to tree. I made it to the road crossing around midnight and flagged down the first car I saw. The driver was a local sheriff's deputy who took one look at my torn clothes and bleeding face and asked what had happened. I told him the whole story and his expression got grimmer with each detail. He told me I was not the first hiker to report being led off the trail by helpful locals in that area. There had been 3 missing persons cases in the past 2 years, all solo hikers who had vanished somewhere in that section of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The deputies said they suspected there was a group of men living off the grid back in those woods, targeting vulnerable hikers. But the terrain was so rough, and the forest so vast that they had never been able to track them down. I never found out what Billy and his friends had planned to do with me, and I do not want to know. What I do know is that I came very close to becoming another missing person statistic in the Appalachian Mountains. I have not been hiking alone since that day, and I never will again. The mountains are beautiful, but they hide dangers that go far beyond wild animals and getting lost. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who offer to help you find your way. I inherited something I never should have from my grandfather when he passed away last October. My name is Rebecca Thompson. I'm from Portland, Maine, and I had always known that my grandfather owned some property down in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, but I had never visited it. He was not the type of man who talked much about his past or his family history. When he died at 93, he left me his entire estate, including a remote cabin that had been in our family for over a century. My grandfather, Samuel Thompson, had been born and raised in those West Virginia mountains before moving north in the 1950s. He rarely spoke about his childhood or why he had left the mountains behind. Whenever family members asked about his early life, he would change the subject or give vague answers about wanting better opportunities up north. The few times I had pressed him for details, his eyes would go distant, and he would say that some places were better left in the past. The lawyer handling the estate told me the cabin sat on 47 acres of heavily forested land in a hollow called Serpent's Gap, about 30 mi from the nearest town. There was no electricity, no running water, and the only access was a dirt road that became impassable during heavy rain or snow. The property taxes were minimal, and there had been no maintenance done on the cabin in decades. The lawyer suggested I might want to sell the land to a timber company and forget about it entirely. But something about inheriting this mysterious family property intrigued me. I was between jobs at the time, having recently finished a contract with an environmental consulting firm, and I decided to drive down to West Virginia to see what my grandfather had left me. Maybe I could fix up the cabin and use it as a retreat. Or maybe I would discover it was completely worthless and sell it off. Either way, I wanted to see this piece of my family history that my grandfather had kept hidden for so many years. The drive from Maine to West Virginia took me 2 days. I spent the night in a motel in Beckley and drove out to Serpent's Gap the next morning. The directions the lawyer had given me led me deep into coal country, through small towns that looked like they had been abandoned decades ago. Empty storefronts, boarded-up houses, and the occasional person sitting on a porch who watched my car pass with suspicious eyes. The dirt road that led to the cabin was barely wide enough for my Honda Civic. Tree branches scraped against both sides of the car as I wound my way up into the mountains, following a creek that got narrower and more overgrown with each mile. After about 40 minutes of careful driving, I finally saw the cabin through the trees. My first impression was that the place was in better condition than I had expected. It was a traditional log cabin, probably built in the early 1900s with a stone chimney and a covered front porch. The roof looked solid, and while the logs had weathered to a dark gray color, the structure appeared sound. Somebody had maintained this place more recently than the lawyer had suggested. I parked next to the cabin and walked around the property. There was an old well with a hand pump that still worked, an outhouse that had been built more recently than the main cabin, and several smaller outbuildings that looked like they had been used for storage. The forest pressed in close on all sides with towering oaks and maples that blocked out most of the sunlight. Even in the middle of the day, the hollow felt dim and enclosed. The front door was unlocked, which surprised me until I realized we were probably 20 miles from the nearest neighbor. Inside, the cabin was furnished with simple handmade furniture that looked like it dated back to the 1940s or 1950s. There was a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area with no appliances, 2 bedrooms, and a main living area with shelves full of books and what looked like personal belongings. That was when I realized my grandfather had been coming back here regularly, probably for decades. The cabin was not abandoned at all. There were recent additions like a batter-report radio, canned goods with expiration dates from just a few years ago, and clothes hanging in one of the bedroom closets that I recognized as my grandfather's. This had been his secret retreat, a place he had been visiting without ever telling any of the family about it. I spent the first day exploring the cabin and going through my grandfather's belongings. Most of it was unremarkable. Old hunting and fishing magazines, basic camping supplies, a few changes of clothes. But in the bedroom that had clearly been his, I found a wooden chest tucked under the bed that contained something much more interesting. The chest was full of old photographs, letters, and what appeared to be journal entries dating back to the 1940s. The photographs showed my grandfather as a young man, along with other people I did not recognize. All of them posed in front of various locations around the mountain property. There were pictures of hunting trips, family gatherings, and what looked like some kind of community events or celebrations. But as I went through the photographs chronologically, I noticed something disturbing. In the earlier pictures, there were always 8 or 9 people in the group photos. But as the years progressed, there were fewer and fewer people until by the 1950s, My grandfather was appearing alone in most of the pictures. Where had everyone else gone? The journal entries provided some answers, but they raised even more troubling questions. My grandfather had been keeping detailed records of something he called the feeding schedule. The early entries from the 1940s mention taking turns with other family members, making sure someone visited the hungry place at least once a month during the warm seasons. He wrote about leaving offerings of fresh meat, usually deer or rabbit, at a specific location he referred to as the mouth. As I read further, I began to understand that my grandfather and his extended family had been caretakers for something that lived in the mountains around the cabin. Something that required regular feeding to keep it satisfied and prevent it from wandering down into the valleys where other people lived. The journal entries described this thing as ancient, something that had been in these mountains long before white settlers arrived, something that the Cherokee tribes had known about and respected. According to my grandfather's notes, his family had made some kind of agreement with this entity generations ago in exchange for keeping it fed and hidden. It would protect their land and their family from outsiders who meant them harm. But the agreement came with strict rules and terrible consequences for anyone who broke them. The journal entries from the late 1940s described what happened when his cousin Robert tried to leave the mountain and moved to Charleston without completing his assigned feeding duties. Robert disappeared on his way out of state, and his car was found a week later, completely destroyed with no trace of Robert himself. My grandfather wrote that they all knew what had happened, but there was nothing they could do except continue honoring their obligations. One by one, family members had either died or disappeared until my grandfather was the only one left to maintain the feeding schedule. The later journal entries showed his growing desperation as he aged and realized he might not be able to keep up his duties much longer. He had tried to find other family members who could take over, but most of his relatives had moved away from the mountains and wanted nothing to do with what they saw as backward superstitions. The final journal entry was dated just 3 months before my grandfather died. He wrote that he was too old and sick to make the monthly trips to the feeding place, and that he could sense the thing in the mountains growing restless and hungry. He was afraid of what might happen if no one continued the feedings after he was gone. He had decided to leave the property to me, his only granddaughter, in hopes that I might understand the importance of continuing the family obligation. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in an old piece of canvas, I found a hand-drawn map showing the location of the mouth and detailed instructions for what kinds of offerings were acceptable. According to my grandfather's notes, the feeding place was a natural cave opening about 2 mi up the mountain from the cabin, hidden in a grove of dead trees that nothing would grow near. I sat in that dim cabin, reading my grandfather's journals by lamplight, and tried to make sense of what I had discovered. Part of me wanted to dismiss the whole thing as the superstitious beliefs of an isolated mountain family. But another part of me could not ignore the fact that my grandfather had maintained these rituals for over 60 years, long after he had moved away and started a new life in Maine. He had never spoken to anyone about it, but he had never stopped coming back to feed whatever lived in these mountains. As the sun set on my first day at the cabin, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It started as a low humming sound, almost like singing coming from somewhere deep in the forest around the cabin. The sound was not quite human, but it had an intelligence to it, a deliberate pattern that suggested communication rather than just animal noise. I looked at my grandfather's journal and found an entry describing exactly what I was hearing. He called it the calling song and wrote that it meant the thing in the mountains knew someone new had arrived at the cabin. It was curious about me, testing to see if I understood my responsibilities or if I was just another ignorant outsider who would need to be dealt with. The humming continued for about an hour, circling the cabin at a distance, never coming close enough for me to see what was making the sound. Eventually, it faded away, leaving me alone with the journal and the growing realization that I had inherited much more than just a cabin and 47 acres of mountain property. I had inherited a family curse that had been passed down for generations, and something hungry was waiting in the darkness to see what I would do about it. Let me be upfront. I was young and stupid and looking for adventure when this happened 5 years ago. My name is Tyler Kowalski. I am from Chicago and I was 21 years old at the time, finishing up my junior year at Northwestern University. I was studying journalism and had this romantic idea about finding authentic American stories in places that tourists never visited. That spring break, instead of going to Cancun with my fraternity brothers, I decided to take a road trip through rural Appalachia to write articles about the real mountain culture that still existed in these remote hollows. I had read about the moonshine tradition that supposedly still thrived in the backwoods of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, despite being illegal for nearly a century. I wanted to find the real thing. Not the sanitized tourist version they sold in gift shops, but actual white lightning made by families who had been distilling corn liquor since before Prohibition. I figured if I could get access to that world and write about it authentically, it would make a great piece for the campus newspaper and maybe even catch the attention of some real publications. I spent the first week of my trip driving through small mountain towns, talking to locals in diners and gas stations, trying to get leads on where I might find traditional moonshiners. Most people either claimed to know nothing about it or gave me vague directions to tourist distilleries that were completely legal and boring. But in a town called Colton, West Virginia, I finally got a real lead. I was eating breakfast at a truck stop diner when I overheard two men at the next table talking about someone named Old Pete who was having trouble with his latest batch. They mentioned something about the copper being off and needing to start over before the revenuers caught wind. When they left, I followed them outside and introduced myself as a college student writing about Appalachian culture. I told them I was interested in learning about traditional mountain crafts and customs. The older of the two men, who introduced himself as Dale, looked me up and down with shrewd eyes. He had the weathered face of someone who had spent his entire life working outdoors with calloused hands and clothes that smelled like tobacco and motor oil. After a few minutes of careful questioning about what exactly I wanted to know and why, he seemed to make some kind of decision about me. Dale told me that if I was really serious about understanding mountain culture, I needed to see how things were still done the old way by people who had never stopped following their grandfather's methods. He said there was a man named Pete Hartley who ran a traditional operation up in Bent Creek Hollow about 30 mi deeper into the mountains. Dale warned me that Pete was suspicious of outsiders and did not like strangers showing up unannounced. But if Dale vouched for me, Pete might be willing to show me around and answer some questions. I agreed immediately, probably too eagerly because Dale gave me a long look and said I needed to understand that what Pete was doing was still illegal, even if it was traditional. If I was planning to write anything that could bring law enforcement attention to Pete's operation, Dale would make sure I regretted it. The way he said it was not exactly threatening, but it was clear that these mountain people took care of their own and did not appreciate being betrayed by city folks they had trusted. Dale told me to meet him the next morning at a gas station on the outskirts of Colleton, and he would drive me up to Pete's place. He said I should bring cash if I wanted to buy any samples, and I should be prepared to keep my mouth shut about anything I saw that was not directly related to the moonshine making process. The next morning, I met Dale at the gas station as planned. He was driving a beat-up pickup truck that looked like it was held together with duct tape and prayer, but the engine ran smoothly and quietly. We drove deeper into the mountains than I had been before, following increasingly narrow and rough roads that wound through dense forest and past the occasional abandoned coal mine. After about 45 minutes, Dale turned onto what I initially thought was just a hiking trail, but turned out to be a dirt road that was barely wide enough for the truck. We bounced and lurched our way up a steep mountainside with tree branches scraping against both sides of the vehicle. Dale explained that Pete's operation was located way back in the woods, far from any main roads, where the smoke from his still would not be visible to anyone who might report it to the authorities. When we finally reached Pete's place, I was surprised by how elaborate the setup was. There were several buildings scattered around a natural clearing, including what looked like a traditional log cabin, a large shed that was obviously the distillery, and several smaller outbuildings for storage and equipment. The whole operation was hidden under the forest canopy, completely invisible from the air and accessible only by the rough road we had just navigated. Pete Hartley himself was exactly what I had expected a traditional moonshiner to look like. He was probably in his 60s with a long gray beard and suspicious eyes that seemed to take in every detail of my appearance and demeanor. He was wearing overalls and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. And he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who was completely comfortable in his domain. Dale introduced me as the college boy he had mentioned, and Pete nodded without much enthusiasm. He agreed to show me around his operation and answer some questions, but he made it clear that I was there as Dale's guest, and I should not expect any special treatment just because I was writing a school paper. The moonshine operation was fascinating from a historical and cultural perspective. Pete was using methods and equipment that had been passed down through his family for 4 generations. The still itself was a work of art. All copper pipes and carefully calibrated components that Pete had built himself using knowledge that his grandfather had taught him. He explained the entire process from selecting the right corn and ensuring proper fermentation to managing the temperature and timing of the distillation. Pete was clearly passionate about his craft and took pride in producing what he claimed was some of the finest white lightning in the entire region. He let me taste several different batches, explaining the subtle differences in flavor that resulted from variations in ingredients and technique. The moonshine was incredibly strong, much more potent than anything I had ever tried, and I could feel it burning all the way down to my stomach. As the afternoon wore on, more people began arriving at Pete's compound. They came in pickup trucks and ATVs, following the same rough road that Dale and I had used. Pete introduced them as customers and friends, local people who had been buying his moonshine for years. They were friendly enough to me, but I got the impression that they were all watching me carefully, trying to decide whether I could be trusted to keep their secrets. That was when I made my first mistake. I had brought a small digital camera to take pictures for my article, and I asked Pete if I could photograph some of the equipment and maybe get a shot of him working at the still. Pete immediately said no, but I pressed him, explaining that the pictures would really help readers understand the traditional craft and culture I was writing about. Several of the other men exchanged looks, and the atmosphere in the clearing suddenly became much more tense. Dale pulled me aside and quietly explained that I had just asked Pete to create evidence that could be used to prosecute him and shut down an operation that had been in his family for nearly a century. He suggested I put the camera away and not mention it again. I apologized and assured everyone that I understood their concerns about photography. The tension seemed to ease somewhat, and we continued talking about the history and traditions of moonshine production in the region. But I could tell that my request for pictures had damaged the trust that Dale had worked to establish on my behalf. As the sun began to set, more people continued to arrive at the compound. I noticed that some of the newer arrivals were carrying weapons, not just hunting rifles, but handguns and what looked like military-style firearms. The conversation gradually shifted away from moonshine production to other topics that I did not entirely understand, but that clearly involved illegal activities beyond simple liquor distillation. That was when I made my second and much more serious mistake. One of the newcomers was a man in his 30s who had arrived on an ATV with a large backpack. He was conducting some kind of business with Pete that involved exchanging cash for small packages that definitely were not moonshine. My journalistic curiosity got the better of me, and I started paying close attention to their conversation, trying to understand what was being discussed. The man with the backpack noticed me listening and asked Pete who I was and why there was a stranger at the compound during a business meeting. Pete explained that I was Dale's guest, just a college kid writing about moonshine traditions. But the man was clearly not satisfied with that explanation. He pointed out that I had already asked to take pictures, and now I was obviously eavesdropping on private conversations that had nothing to do with moonshine. Several of the armed men gathered around, and I realized I was in serious trouble. These were not just friendly mountain moonshiners showing off their traditional craft to an interested student. This was some kind of criminal organization that used Pete's remote compound as a meeting place and distribution point for activities that went far beyond illegal liquor production. The man with the backpack asked me directly what I had seen and heard since arriving at the compound. I tried to play dumb, saying I had only been interested in learning about moonshine and had not paid attention to anything else, but he was not buying it, and neither were the other men who had gathered around me. Dale tried to vouch for me, saying I was just a naive college kid who did not understand what he had stumbled into, but the damage was done. The man with the backpack said that bringing an outsider to the compound during a business meeting was a serious security breach, and there needed to be consequences to make sure it never happened again. That was when they brought out the rope and the metal chair, and I realized I was about to become an object lesson in what happened to people who saw too much in these mountains. Pete looked genuinely sorry about what was going to happen, but he did not try to stop it. Dale just shook his head and said he had warned me to keep my mouth shut about anything that was not directly related to moonshine. The next few hours were the most terrifying of my life, but I survived, and I never wrote the article about traditional moonshine culture in Appalachian Mountains. Some stories are not worth telling. I lost 3 days of my life in those mountains, and I only remember fragments of what happened during that time. My name is Amanda Foster. I am from Phoenix, Arizona. And what I am about to tell you happened 2 years ago during what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip in the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. I am a software engineer, a logical person who believes in facts and evidence. But what happened to me in those mountains defies every rational explanation I can think of. I had been going through a difficult divorce at the time, and my therapist had suggested that I try some solo activities to help rebuild my sense of independence and confidence. I had always enjoyed hiking and camping, but I had not done much of it since my marriage began falling apart. I decided to take a long weekend and drive from Phoenix to Tennessee to spend some time alone in the wilderness, hiking and camping in areas I had never explored before. I arrived at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park on a Thursday afternoon in late September. The fall colors were just beginning to change, and the weather was perfect for hiking and camping. I had reserved a backcountry campsite for 3 nights, planning to spend Friday, Saturday, and Sunday exploring some of the more remote trails before driving back to Arizona on Monday. My campsite was located about 4 miles from the nearest trailhead, accessible only by hiking through dense forest along a narrow mountain trail. I had been backpacking for years and was comfortable with the isolation, but I had never camped quite this far from civilization before. The nearest other campers were at least 2 mi away, and during the day I never saw another person on the trails. Thursday evening, I set up my tent, cooked dinner on my camp stove, and settled in for what I expected to be a peaceful night under the stars. I remember sitting by my campfire around 9:00, reading a book and enjoying the sounds of the forest around me. The last clear memory I have from that first night is checking my watch at 9:47 p.m. and thinking about turning in early so I could get an early start hiking the next morning. The next thing I remember is waking up on Sunday afternoon in a completely different location. I was lying on bare ground in a grove of dead trees about half a mile from my original campsite. My tent, my backpack, and all of my gear were nowhere to be seen. I was wearing the same clothes I had put on Thursday morning, but they were filthy and torn in several places. My hiking boots were missing, and my feet were cut and bruised, like I had been walking over rough terrain barefoot for hours. When I checked my watch, it was 3:30 p.m. on Sunday. I had lost almost 3 complete days with no memory of what had happened during that time. My mouth was dry. I was incredibly hungry and I felt weak, like I had not eaten or had much water in days. But the strangest thing was that I did not feel like I had been unconscious or sick. I felt alert and aware, just completely confused about where I was and how I'd gotten there. I tried to retrace my steps back to my campsite, but nothing looked familiar. The grove of dead trees where I had awakened was unlike anything I had seen during my hike in on Thursday. All of the trees in the area appeared to have died recently. Their bark was black and peeling, and nothing was growing on the forest floor beneath them. Even more disturbing, the trees seemed to have died in a perfect circle, with healthy forest surrounding the dead zone on all sides. In the center of the grove, there was a natural depression in the ground that looked almost like a shallow crater. The soil was dark and had an oily texture that did not seem natural. When I knelt down to examine it more closely, I could smell something chemical and unpleasant, like sulfur mixed with rotting vegetation. Carved into the largest of the dead trees were symbols that I did not recognize. They were not letters or numbers, but geometric patterns that had been cut deep into the bark with some kind of sharp tool. The cuts looked fresh, and some of them were still oozing sap, despite the fact that the tree appeared to have been dead for months. I spent about an hour searching the area for my camping gear, but I could not find any trace of my tent, backpack, or supplies. It was like they had simply vanished. Eventually, I gave up looking and tried to find my way back to the main trail so I could hike out to my car and figure out what had happened. That turned out to be much more difficult than I expected. I had hiked these mountains before, and I was usually good at navigation, but nothing looked right. The terrain seemed different than what I remembered from my hike in on Thursday. Hills and ridges that I was certain should have been in specific locations were nowhere to be found. Even the position of the sun seemed wrong for the time of day and season. I wandered through the forest for several hours, growing increasingly desperate and confused. I should have been able to find the main trail easily from where I was, but every direction I tried led me deeper into unfamiliar territory. It was like the landscape itself had changed during the 3 days I could not remember. Just before sunset, I finally encountered another person. He was an elderly man wearing a park ranger uniform, walking alone on what appeared to be a game trail. When he saw me, he immediately asked if I was Amanda Foster and said that people had been looking for me since Friday morning, when I had failed to check in at the ranger station as required for backcountry campers. The ranger, whose name was Bill Atrix, had been part of the search team that had been combing the area for me since Friday afternoon. He said they had found my abandoned campsite on Saturday morning with my tent still set up, but no sign of me anywhere. There had been no evidence of a struggle or animal attack. I had simply vanished without leaving any tracks or clues about which direction I had gone. Ranger Atris radioed for assistance and then escorted me back to the ranger station, where I was questioned by park officials and local law enforcement about what had happened during the missing 3 days. The problem was that I genuinely could not remember anything after sitting by my campfire Thursday evening. I had no explanation for how I had ended up in the grove of dead trees, what had happened to my camping gear, or why I had no memory of the intervening time. The medical examination at the local hospital revealed some disturbing findings. I had multiple small cuts and scrapes on my arms and legs that appeared to be several days old and partially healed. There were also what looked like injection sites on both of my arms, like someone had been drawing blood or administering drugs intravenously. The blood tests came back clean for common drugs and toxins. But the doctor said there were hundreds of substances that would not show up in standard screening. Most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be surgical scars on my scalp hidden under my hair. They were small, maybe half an inch long each, and looked like they had been made with precise instruments. The doctor who examined them said they appeared to be recent, probably made within the past few days. But I had no memory of any medical procedures or injuries that would have required such treatment. Over the following weeks, I began to have disturbing dreams that might have been recovered memories from the missing 3 days. In these dreams, I was lying on a metal table in some kind of underground facility, surrounded by people in medical scrubs who were conducting tests and procedures that I could not fully understand. There were bright lights, the sound of electronic equipment, and conversations in voices that seemed somehow not quite human. In one particularly vivid dream, I was conscious, but unable to move while someone was examining my brain using equipment that looked far more advanced than anything I had ever seen in a regular medical facility. They were inserting thin probes through the small incisions in my scalp and monitoring my responses on screens that showed complex patterns and data. The most terrifying part of these dreams was the growing certainty that they were not dreams at all, but actual memories that were slowly returning despite efforts to suppress them. I began to remember being taken from my campsite by people who moved through the forest with unnatural silence and coordination. I remembered being transported through underground tunnels that connected different parts of the mountain, and being held in a facility that definitely was not any kind of legitimate research installation. I also began to remember other people who had been brought to the same facility, other hikers and campers who had disappeared in the area over the years. Some of them had been there much longer than me, and they showed signs of repeated procedures and long-term imprisonment. I remembered being told that I was being prepared for something, but I could never quite recall what that something was supposed to be. When I tried to report these recovered memories to law enforcement, I was told that there was no evidence of any underground facilities in the area, and that my experiences were likely the result of trauma-induced hallucinations or false memories. The official explanation for my disappearance was that I had become disoriented, wandered away from my campsite, and suffered a head injury that caused temporary amnesia. But I know that explanation is not true. Something happened to me during those 3 missing days. Something that involved people or entities with technology and capabilities far beyond what should exist in a remote national park. The physical evidence on my body, the surgical scars and the injection sites prove that I did not simply wander around the forest in a confused state for 3 days. I have never returned to the Great Smoky Mountains, and I probably never will. But sometimes late at night, I remember fragments of conversations and procedures that convince me that whatever was done to me during those missing days is not finished yet. The storm came out of nowhere, and I had no choice but to seek shelter wherever I could find it. My name is Jonathan Miller. I am from Seattle, Washington. And what happened to me during that storm in the mountains of North Carolina will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was 34 years old at the time, working as a freelance photographer specializing in landscape and nature photography. I had driven across the country to capture the fall colors in the Blue Ridge Mountains, planning to spend 2 weeks camping and hiking through the most remote and scenic areas I could find. It was my 3rd day in the mountains when the weather took a violent turn. I had been photographing an old abandoned homestead about 8 mi from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a rough logging road that wound deep into the national forest. The morning had been clear and beautiful, perfect for the kind of atmospheric shots I was hoping to capture. But by early afternoon, dark clouds were building rapidly over the peaks to the west. Mountain weather can change quickly, but this storm system looked particularly threatening. The clouds were an ominous dark green color that I had never seen before, and they were moving across the sky much faster than seemed natural. Within minutes, the temperature dropped at least 20 degrees, and the wind began howling through the trees with a sound like freight trains. I had been planning to hike back to my campsite before the storm hit, but I quickly realized I was not going to make it. The first raindrops were already falling, and they were coming down with unusual force, hitting the ground and the leaves around me like small bullets. Lightning was beginning to flash in the distance, and the thunder that followed was so loud it seemed to shake the entire mountain. I looked around desperately for any kind of shelter and spotted what appeared to be a cabin about half a mile up the mountainside. It was partially hidden by the forest, but I could see smoke rising from a chimney, which meant someone was home and might let me wait out the storm. I gathered my camera equipment as quickly as possible and started running toward the cabin just as the sky opened up and the real deluge began. The rain was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was not just heavy, it was violent, coming down so hard that it was difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction. The wind was gusting strong enough to knock me off balance, and the lightning was striking constantly, turning the dark afternoon into a strobing nightmare of light and shadow. By the time I reached the cabin, I was completely soaked and shivering uncontrollably. The structure was older than it had appeared from a distance, probably built in the 1940s or 1950s, with a sagging roof and windows that were covered with what looked like newspaper from the inside. There was definitely someone home, because I could see lamplight flickering through gaps in the newspaper, and the smoke from the chimney was still rising despite the driving rain. I pounded on the front door and called out that I was a hiker caught in the storm and desperately needed shelter. For a long moment, there was no response, and I was beginning to think no one had heard me over the sound of the wind and rain. Then I heard footsteps inside, and the door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with long gray streaked hair and eyes that seemed too bright in the lamplight. She looked me up and down without saying anything, taking in my soaked clothes and expensive camera equipment. Finally, she stepped aside and gestured for me to come inside. I thanked her profusely as I entered, dripping water all over her floor and apologizing for the intrusion. She closed the door behind me and turned several heavy locks that I had not noticed from the outside. The interior of the cabin was dimly lit by oil lamps and a fire in the stone fireplace. It was furnished with handmade furniture that looked like it had been built decades ago, and the walls were covered with animal pelts and what appeared to be hunting trophies. But there was something wrong with the trophies. They were not normal deer heads or bear pelts. Some of the skulls were shaped wrong, too elongated, or with too many teeth, and the pelts had patterns and colors that did not match any animals I recognized. The woman introduced herself as Mary and said I was welcome to stay until the storm passed. She offered me a towel and a cup of what she said was herbal tea, which tasted bitter and had an aftertaste that reminded me of medicine. She seemed friendly enough, but there was something in her manner that made me uncomfortable. She kept staring at me with those bright eyes, and she had a habit of smiling at inappropriate moments, like when I mentioned being worried about flash floods or getting struck by lightning. As I sat by the fire trying to warm up and dry out my clothes, I became aware that Mary was not alone in the cabin. I could hear movement in the back rooms, footsteps, and occasional voices that were too quiet for me to make out the words. When I asked if other family members lived there, Mary smiled and said I would meet them soon enough. The storm continued to rage outside with no sign of letting up. The wind was howling around the cabin so loudly that it was difficult to carry on a conversation, and the lightning strikes were so frequent that the entire structure would light up every few seconds. Mary explained that storms in these mountains could last for hours, sometimes even days, and that I might need to stay the night if conditions did not improve. That was when I met the rest of the family. The first to emerge from the back rooms was a man who appeared to be Mary's husband. He was tall and gaunt with long hair that looked like it had not been washed in weeks, and clothes that were stained with substances I did not want to identify. He moved with a strange, shambling gait, and when he looked at me, his eyes had the same unnaturally bright quality as Mary's. He was followed by what I initially thought were their children. But as they came closer to the firelight, I realized something was very wrong with all of them. There were 3 younger people, probably in their 20s or 30s, but they all had physical deformities that suggested serious genetic problems. One had arms that were different lengths. Another had facial features that were severely asymmetrical, and the third moved with a limping gait that indicated major problems with their spine or legs. All of them stared at me with the same bright, unsettling eyes, and none of them spoke. Mary introduced them as her family, but did not give any names. She explained that they did not get many visitors in their remote location, and that they were always excited to meet new people who might be able to stay for a while. The way she said stay for a while made my blood run cold. I began to get the impression that visitors to this cabin might not always be free to leave when they wanted to. I told Mary that I appreciated their hospitality, but that I needed to get back to my campsite as soon as the storm passed, because people would be worried about me if I did not check in. Mary smiled and said that the storm was just getting started and that it might be days before it was safe to travel through the mountains again. She suggested I make myself comfortable because I was going to be their guest for quite some time. That was when I noticed that all of the windows in the cabin were not just covered with newspaper from the inside. They were also boarded up from the outside. The heavy locks on the front door were designed to keep people in, not out. And the hunting trophies on the walls were not from animals at all. They were from people. I recognized human skulls that had been modified and decorated to look like animal remains. There were scalps with hair still attached, hanging next to what I had initially thought were deer pelts. In the flickering lamplight, I could see photographs tacked to the wall showing previous guests who had sought shelter in this cabin during storms. The family was still standing around me in a semicircle, staring with those bright predatory eyes. Mary was explaining that they had developed their own ways of surviving in the remote mountains, ways that did not depend on the outside world for anything they needed. She said they had learned to make use of everything that came their way, including unexpected visitors who got caught in bad weather. I realized I was in serious danger and needed to get out of the cabin immediately, storm or no storm. I told them I had remembered that I needed to retrieve some important equipment from my car before the weather got any worse. Mary laughed and said my car was probably already washed away by the flash flooding, and that even if it was not, I would never be able to find it again in the dark and the storm. She was probably right about that, but I knew I had to try. I stood up and moved toward the door, but the man I had assumed was Mary's husband stepped in front of me and shook his head. He was holding something behind his back, and when he brought it around, I saw it was a length of rope with a noose already tied in one end. The three younger family members moved to block the other potential exits from the main room, and Mary continued talking about how they were going to take good care of me and make sure I became a permanent part of their mountain family. She explained that the storm was a gift that had brought me to them, just like it had brought so many others over the years. I knew I had one chance to escape, and I had to take it before they could restrain me. The front door was still my best option, even though the man with the rope was standing in front of it. I pretended to stumble and fall toward the fireplace, then grabbed a burning piece of wood and swung it at him as hard as I could. The burning log caught him across the face and neck, and he screamed and fell backward, dropping the rope and clutching at his burned skin. I kicked over one of the oil lamps, splashing burning fuel across the floor, then threw my full weight against the front door. The locks were strong, but the old wood around them was not. The door frame splintered and gave way, and I burst out into the storm. Behind me, I could hear the family screaming and cursing, and I could see flames beginning to spread across the floor of the cabin. I ran into the storm and never looked back. I am a geologist, so when I found the entrance, curiosity got the better of me. My name is Dr. Patricia Williams. I am from Boston, Massachusetts. And what I discovered in those abandoned mine shafts in the mountains of eastern Kentucky will haunt me until the day I die. I'd been conducting a geological survey for a mining company that was considering reopening some of the old coal extraction sites that had been abandoned since the 1970s. My job was to assess the structural integrity of the existing tunnels and determine whether they could be safely expanded for modern mining operations. I had been working in the area for 3 weeks, mapping and photographing dozens of abandoned mine entrances scattered throughout the mountainous terrain. Most of them were exactly what you would expect from old coal mines: dark, partially collapsed tunnels that extended maybe a few hundred ft into the mountainside before becoming too dangerous or unstable to explore further. But this particular mine was different from the moment I first saw it. The entrance was much larger than the others I had surveyed, and it showed signs of more recent activity than should have been possible for a mine that had supposedly been abandoned for nearly 50 years. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt leading up to the opening, and someone had recently cleared away vegetation and debris that would have accumulated over decades of neglect. Most tellingly, there was electrical conduit running into the tunnel, suggesting that someone had installed modern lighting and possibly other equipment inside. My initial assumption was that local authorities, or perhaps the previous mining company, had been conducting their own safety inspections or environmental assessments. But when I checked my records and contacted the company that had originally operated the mine, I discovered that no one had been authorized to access the site in over 20 years. The local sheriff's department also had no record of any recent activity in the area. This presented me with a dilemma. As a professional geologist conducting an official survey, I was supposed to document and assess all existing mine infrastructure in the area. But if someone was using this particular mine for unauthorized purposes, I might be walking into a dangerous situation. After considerable deliberation, I decided that my scientific curiosity and professional obligations outweighed my personal safety concerns. I equipped myself with all of the standard safety gear for underground exploration. Hard hat with mounted light, backup flashlights, portable air quality monitor, emergency beacon, and enough water and emergency supplies for several hours underground. I also brought my digital camera and measuring equipment to document whatever I found inside the mine. The electrical conduit led about 200 FT into the tunnel before connecting to a series of work lights that had been professionally installed along the ceiling. Someone had invested significant time and money in making this abandoned mine accessible and functional. The tunnel itself was in remarkably good condition with timber supports that appeared to have been recently reinforced in a floor that had been cleared and leveled. As I went deeper into the mine, following the electrical conduit and the line of work lights, I began to notice side passages that branched off from the main tunnel. These appeared to be original mining corridors, but several of them had been modified with new metal doors that looked completely out of place in an abandoned coal mine. The doors were heavy steel construction with multiple locking mechanisms, more like what you might find in a high-security facility than in an industrial mine. My air quality monitor was registering normal levels of oxygen and no dangerous gases, so I continued deeper into the tunnel system. About half a mile from the entrance, I reached what appeared to be the main excavation area where the original coal extraction had taken place. But instead of the empty cavern I expected, I found a sophisticated underground facility that had been constructed within the natural mining chambers. There were multiple rooms that had been carved out of the rock walls and fitted with modern amenities: electric lighting, ventilation systems, running water, and what appeared to be laboratory equipment. The construction was professional quality. Clearly, the work of experienced contractors with access to specialized underground construction techniques. This was not some amateur operation thrown together by local criminals or drug manufacturers. In the largest of the underground rooms, I found something that made my scientific training completely irrelevant. Along one wall were dozens of metal filing cabinets filled with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be medical records. The documents dated back to the 1940s and continued up to within the past few months. They detailed some kind of long-term research project that had been conducted in this location for over 70 years. The photographs were the most disturbing part. They showed people of various ages, from children to elderly adults, who appeared to be subjects in some kind of medical or psychological experiments. Many of the subjects showed obvious signs of physical distress, malnutrition, and what looked like surgical procedures that had been performed without proper medical care. The more recent photographs were in color and showed much clearer detail of procedures that violated every ethical standard of human medical research. According to the documents, the research project had been initiated in the 1940s as part of a government program to study the effects of isolation, sensory deprivation, and various experimental drugs on human subjects. The original funding had come from federal agencies, but by the 1960s, the project had apparently been transferred to private contractors who continued the research without official oversight or approval. The subjects appeared to be people who would not be missed by the outside world. Homeless individuals, runaway teenagers, and people with mental illness who had been institutionalized. Many of the files indicated that subjects had been told they were participating in legitimate medical studies or job training programs. But once they arrived at the facility, they had been held against their will and subjected to procedures that could only be described as torture. The most recent files showed that the project was still active and that new subjects were being brought to the facility on a regular basis. There were detailed records of how subjects were recruited, transported to the mine, and processed through various experimental protocols. Many of the recent entries mentioned subjects who had been acquired from hiking trails, campgrounds, and other outdoor recreation areas throughout the Appalachian region. I realized I had stumbled onto evidence of a decades-long criminal conspiracy that involved kidnapping, human experimentation, and probably murder on a massive scale. I immediately began photographing as many documents as possible, trying to create a comprehensive record of what I had discovered before reporting it to law enforcement authorities. That was when I heard voices coming from one of the side passages. I quickly turned off my headlamp and crouched behind one of the filing cabinets, trying to remain as quiet as possible while the voices grew closer. There were at least 3 people, and they were discussing schedules and procedures in the clinical professional manner of people who were completely comfortable with what they were doing. One of them mentioned that they needed to prepare for a new arrival who would be brought to the facility later that evening. They discussed which experimental protocol would be most appropriate for this particular subject and debated the optimal dosage levels for the drugs they planned to administer. They talked about human beings like they were laboratory animals, with no recognition that they were planning to torture and probably kill another person. The voices were coming from a passage that led deeper into the mine toward areas that I had not yet explored. I realized that there were probably additional rooms and facilities beyond what I had already discovered, and that there might be current victims being held in those areas right now. I was faced with an impossible choice. The rational thing to do would be to leave the mine immediately, drive to the nearest town with cell phone coverage, and contact federal law enforcement agencies about what I had discovered. But if there were people being held captive in the deeper parts of the mine, they might be moved or killed before authorities could organize a rescue operation. I decided to try to gather more information about the current situation before leaving to contact law enforcement. I waited until the voices faded away, then carefully made my way toward the passage where I had heard them talking. The electrical conduit continued in that direction, suggesting that there were indeed additional facilities deeper in the mine. What I found in those deeper chambers was worse than anything I could have imagined. There were holding cells that contained people in various states of physical and psychological distress. Some appeared to be drugged or sedated. Others were conscious but showed signs of prolonged abuse and malnutrition. All of them had identification numbers tattooed on their arms like they were inventory in some kind of human warehouse. The people running this facility had turned an abandoned coal mine into a sophisticated underground prison, where they could conduct illegal human experiments without any risk of discovery by outside authorities. They had been operating for decades, perfecting their methods and expanding their capabilities, all while remaining completely invisible to the outside world. I knew I had to document everything I could, and then get out of there immediately to contact law enforcement. But as I was taking photographs of the holding cells, I heard footsteps behind me and realized I had been discovered by whoever was running this nightmare facility. The next few minutes were the most terrifying of my life, but somehow I managed to escape from the mine and make it back to my vehicle. I drove straight to the FBI field office in Lexington and turned over all of the photographs and documentation I had gathered. The federal investigation that followed led to the arrest of 12 people and the rescue of 17 victims who had been held in the underground facility. But I know that what I discovered was just one small part of a much larger network of similar operations hidden throughout the remote areas of Appalachian Mountains. Growing up, my Appalachian grandmother told me stories I thought were just mountain folklore until I experienced the truth for myself. My name is Kevin O'Brien. I am from New Orleans, Louisiana. And what happened to me in the mountains of Southwest Virginia 2 years ago proved that some old legends are based on terrifying reality. My grandmother, Mimosa Sarah, had grown up in those mountains before moving south in the 1950s, and she used to tell me stories about something she called the fiddle man who played music that could drive people to madness. According to Mima Sarah, the fiddle man was an ancient spirit who had been roaming the mountain hollows since before white settlers arrived in the region. He appeared as a tall, thin man in old-fashioned clothes, always carrying a fiddle made from materials that no earthly craftsman could have used. She said his music was the most beautiful and haunting sound anyone could ever hear, but that listening to it for too long would steal your mind and leave you wandering the mountains forever, following the melody deeper and deeper into places where no human should ever go. She told me that her own grandfather had encountered the fiddleman in 1923 while hunting alone in the woods near their family homestead. He had followed the sound of fiddle music for hours, becoming completely lost in the wilderness till he finally came to his senses just before dawn and realized he had no idea where he was or how he had gotten there. It took him 2 days to find his way back home, and for the rest of his life, he would sometimes stop whatever he was doing and tilt his head like he was listening to distant music that no one else could hear. I had always assumed these were just colorful family stories, the kind of folklore that develops in isolated mountain communities where people need entertainment during long winter nights. But when Mima Sarah died last year, she left me her old family homestead in the mountains of Virginia, along with a letter warning me never to stay there alone after dark, especially during the months when the mountain laurel was in bloom. I am a music producer who works primarily with traditional American folk music. So, the idea of owning property in the heart of Appalachian musical culture was incredibly appealing. I decided to spend a long weekend at the homestead, partly to assess the condition of the property, and partly to see if I could record some authentic mountain music in the area where my family had lived for generations. The homestead was located in a narrow hollow called Devil's Backbone, about 15 mi from the nearest paved road. The original log cabin had been built in the 1880s and had been expanded several times over the decades, but it had been vacant for nearly 20 years and needed significant repairs. There was no electricity or running water, but there was a good well and a stone fireplace that still worked perfectly. I arrived on a Friday afternoon in late May when the mountain laurel was indeed in full bloom, creating spectacular displays of white and pink flowers throughout the surrounding forest. I spent the day cleaning up the cabin and setting up my recording equipment, planning to spend the evening documenting the natural sounds of the mountains and maybe interviewing some of the local residents about traditional music and folklore. As the sun began to set, I built a fire in the stone fireplace and settled in with my digital recording devices to capture the ambient sounds of the mountain evening. I was hoping to record owls, nightbirds, and maybe some of the musical insects that are common in Appalachian forests during late spring. What I recorded instead was something that I still cannot fully explain. It started around 10:00 as just a faint melody that seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper in the hollow. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor playing music on their porch, but the nearest house was over 2 mi away, and the sound was definitely coming from the uninhabited forest that surrounded my grandmother's property. The melody was being played on what sounded like a fiddle, but it had qualities that I had never heard in any traditional instrument. The tone was incredibly pure and resonant with harmonics that seemed to hang in the air long after each note was played. It was hauntingly beautiful, unlike any mountain music I had ever heard, and it seemed to blend perfectly with the natural sounds of the forest around it. I immediately started recording, thinking that I had stumbled onto exactly the kind of authentic mountain music that I had been hoping to find. The melody was complex and sophisticated, clearly the work of a master musician who understood traditional Appalachian musical forms, but was taking them in directions that felt both ancient and completely original. As I listened more carefully, I began to recognize elements from ballads and fiddle tunes that my grandmother had sung to me when I was a child. But this musician was weaving them together in ways that created entirely new compositions, building musical narratives that seemed to tell stories about the history and legends of these mountains. The music continued for over an hour, and I found myself becoming completely absorbed in following the intricate melodies and variations. I forgot about everything else and just sat by the fire listening and recording, feeling like I was experiencing something magical and unprecedented in my career as a music producer. That was when I realized the music was getting closer. What had started as distant melodies coming from somewhere deep in the forest was now clearly being played much nearer to the cabin. I could hear footsteps on the wooden porch, the slow, deliberate pace of someone walking back and forth while continuing to play. The fiddle music was now so clear and immediate that it seemed to be coming from right outside the front door. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, expecting to meet a local musician who had heard my recording equipment and decided to share some traditional mountain music with a visitor. But there was no one there. The porch was empty, and I could see no sign of anyone in the clearing around the cabin, but the music continued, now seeming to come from different directions around the cabin, as if the musician was walking in circles around the property while playing. I followed the sound with my flashlight, trying to catch sight of whoever was creating this incredible music, but I never saw another person. The melody began to change, becoming more complex and demanding with rapid passages that required extraordinary technical skill. But there was also something hypnotic about it, something that made it difficult to think about anything else while the music was playing. I found myself walking away from the cabin, following the sound deeper into the forest without consciously deciding to do so. I remembered my grandmother's stories about her grandfather following fiddle music through the woods until he became completely lost, and I forced myself to stop walking and turn back toward the cabin. But when I looked around, I realized I could no longer see the lights from the fireplace or remember which direction I had come from. The music was all around me now, seeming to come from every direction at once. The melody was building to some kind of crescendo, becoming more intense and overwhelming with each passing moment. I felt like I was losing my ability to think rationally, becoming absorbed in the music to the point where nothing else seemed to matter. That was when I saw him. He was standing about 30 feet away, partially hidden by the shadows between two large oak trees. He was tall and impossibly thin, wearing clothes that looked like they might have been fashionable in the 1800s. A long black coat, dark trousers, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. In his hands was a fiddle that seemed to gleam with its own light, even in the darkness of the forest. I could not see his face clearly, but I could tell that he was looking directly at me while he played. The music was coming from his fiddle, but it sounded like it was being amplified by the entire forest, resonating through the trees and rocks and creating harmonics that no normal instrument could produce. As I stared at him, transfixed by the impossible beauty of the music, he began to walk deeper into the forest, never stopping his playing and never taking his eyes off me. I felt an overwhelming compulsion to follow him, to hear more of this incredible music and discover where it would lead. I took several steps toward him before I remembered my grandmother's warnings and the recording equipment I had left running back at the cabin. With enormous effort, I forced myself to turn away from the fiddle man and run back toward the homestead, using my flashlight to navigate through the forest while the music continued behind me, growing fainter but never completely fading away. I found the cabin and immediately gathered my recording equipment, planning to leave the mountains that very night despite the darkness and the rough mountain roads. As I packed my gear, I listened to some of what I had recorded earlier in the evening, and I was shocked by what I heard. The digital recording contained over an hour of the most beautiful fiddle music I had ever heard. But there was something else in the audio that I had not noticed while it was happening. Underneath the melody, barely audible, were human voices, dozens of them, singing along with the fiddle music and harmonies that sounded like they were coming from very far away. I recognized some of the voices, including what sounded exactly like my grandmother singing lullabies she had taught me as a child. But my grandmother had been dead for over a year, and the recording had been made that very evening. I drove out of the mountains that night and have never returned to my family's homestead. I still have the recordings, but I've never been able to bring myself to listen to them again or to share them with anyone else. Some music is too dangerous to be heard, and some family legends are based on truths that are better left buried in the past. I had GPS, satellite phone, all the modern gear. None of it mattered when I encountered something in those mountains that seemed to understand and counter every piece of technology I carried. My name is Michael Chang. I am from San Francisco, California, and I consider myself an expert in wilderness survival and backcountry navigation. I have spent over 15 years leading survival training courses, testing outdoor equipment, and exploring some of the most remote wilderness areas in North America. What happened to me in the mountains of eastern Tennessee last fall challenged everything I thought I knew about survival in the modern age. I had been contracted by a major outdoor equipment manufacturer to field test their latest line of high-tech survival gear in extreme wilderness conditions. The equipment included a military-grade GPS unit with satellite connectivity, an emergency beacon with global positioning capabilities, thermal imaging scope, night vision goggles, and a satellite communication device that could maintain contact with civilization from anywhere on Earth. My job was to spend 2 weeks alone in the most remote part of the Cherokee National Forest, testing each piece of equipment under real survival conditions and documenting its performance for potential military and civilian customers. I had chosen an area that was over 20 mi from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking through extremely rugged terrain that included steep ridges, dense forest, and multiple stream crossings. According to my topographic maps and satellite imagery, there were no established trails, no camping areas, and no record of human activity in the region for several decades. It was exactly the kind of isolated, challenging environment that would provide a thorough test of high-tech survival equipment. The first 3 days went exactly according to plan. I established a base camp in a natural clearing near a reliable water source, tested the GPS and communication equipment, and began documenting the performance of various survival tools and devices. Everything functioned perfectly, and I was impressed by how much easier modern technology made wilderness survival compared to traditional methods. The GPS unit provided precise location data, and could display detailed topographic maps on a high-resolution screen. The satellite phone maintained clear communication with my support team in California, allowing me to transmit daily status reports and equipment evaluations. The thermal imaging and night vision equipment allowed me to navigate and hunt effectively, even in complete darkness. I felt completely in control of my environment and confident that I could handle any emergency situation that might arise. That confidence lasted until the fourth night, when I woke up to find that every single piece of electronic equipment had stopped working simultaneously. The GPS unit was completely dead, showing no display despite having a full battery charge when I had checked it before going to sleep. The satellite phone would not power on, and when I removed the battery and reinstalled it, the device showed error messages that were not in any manual or documentation I had seen. The thermal scope and night vision goggles were similarly non-functional, displaying only static or completely black screens. My first assumption was that I had encountered some kind of electromagnetic interference, possibly from a solar storm or military testing in the area. But when I checked my backup equipment, including mechanical devices like my compass and allometer, I discovered that they were also malfunctioning in ways that made no scientific sense. The compass needle was spinning randomly, never settling on a consistent direction. The altimeter was showing readings that varied by thousands of feet within minutes, despite the fact that I had not changed elevation. Even my mechanical wristwatch had stopped, frozen at 3:17 a.m., which was approximately when I had first noticed the equipment failures. I spent the morning trying to troubleshoot the equipment problems, checking batteries, connections, and settings according to the manufacturer's instructions. Nothing I tried had any effect on the malfunctions. It was as if something was actively interfering with both electronic and mechanical devices, using methods that went beyond any natural phenomenon I could identify without GPS navigation or communication equipment. I was essentially stranded in one of the most remote wilderness areas in the eastern United States. But I had been in similar situations before using only traditional survival methods, and I was confident that I could navigate back to civilization using natural landmarks and basic orienting techniques. That confidence lasted until I realized that the landscape itself seemed to be changing around me. The clearing where I had established my base camp was still there, along with the stream I had been using for water, but the surrounding terrain looked different than it had when I had scouted the area during the previous 3 days. Hills and ridges that I had carefully noted on my topographic maps were no longer in their correct positions relative to my campsite. The stream was flowing in a different direction than I remembered, and several distinctive rock formations that I had been using as navigation landmarks had apparently moved or disappeared entirely. I tried to convince myself that I was simply disoriented due to the stress of having all my equipment fail simultaneously. But when I climbed to the highest point near my campsite to get a better view of the surrounding terrain, I could see that the entire landscape was subtly but definitely different from what my maps indicated should be there. More disturbing was the realization that I was being watched. I first noticed it as just a feeling, the uncomfortable sensation that someone or something was observing me from the surrounding forest. But as the day progressed, I began to catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, always just at the edge of my sight and always disappearing when I turned to look directly. By evening, I was certain that I was being stalked by something that was deliberately staying hidden while monitoring my activities. Whatever it was, moved through the forest with complete silence, never disturbing the undergrowth or making any sound that would give away its position. But I could sense its presence, circling my campsite at a distance and watching everything I did. That night, I decided to use my night vision equipment to try to identify what was stalking me. But when I powered on the night vision goggles, instead of the familiar green-tinted view of the forest, I saw something that defied explanation. The landscape appeared normal through the night vision device, but there were additional elements that were not visible to the naked eye. I could see what appeared to be structures in the forest, geometric patterns and artificial constructions that occupied the same space as trees and rocks, but were somehow separate from the natural environment. More disturbing were the figures that appeared in the night vision display. There were at least a dozen humanoid shapes moving through the forest around my campsite, but they were not quite human. They were too tall, too thin, and they moved in ways that suggested their joints and limbs did not function according to normal anatomy. When I removed the night vision goggles and looked at the same areas with my naked eyes, I saw only normal forest. But when I put the goggles back on, the strange structures and figures were still there, apparently existing in some spectrum of reality that was only visible through the modified electronics of the night vision system. I realized that my high-tech equipment had not simply malfunctioned due to electromagnetic interference or equipment failure. Something had deliberately modified the devices to show me things that existed alongside the normal physical world, but were usually invisible to human perception. The entities that were stalking me were not just watching my activities. They were manipulating my equipment to demonstrate their technological capabilities and to communicate that they were far more advanced than anything human science had developed. Over the following days, the manipulation of my equipment became more sophisticated and more clearly intentional. The GPS unit began displaying locations that did not exist on any earthly map, showing coordinates that placed me on other continents or even other planets. The satellite phone received calls from numbers that had too many digits and transmitted voices speaking in languages that did not sound human. Most unsettling was when the thermal imaging scope began showing heat signatures of the entities that were stalking me. They appeared as complex geometric patterns rather than the normal human or animal heat signatures I was accustomed to seeing. The patterns were constantly shifting and changing, suggesting that these beings existed in dimensions or states of matter that human technology could only partially detect. I attempted to leave the area multiple times, but each effort resulted in becoming even more lost and disoriented. The terrain continued to shift around me with familiar landmarks appearing and disappearing, according to no pattern I could understand. My compass and GPS continued to provide contradictory information, sometimes indicating that I was moving in circles, sometimes suggesting that I was traveling in directions that did not exist on normal topographic maps. After a week of being trapped in this impossible landscape, I finally encountered one of the entities directly. It approached my campsite just before dawn, moving with the fluid, silent motion I had observed through the night vision equipment. Up close, it was clearly not human, though it maintained a roughly humanoid shape. It was over 7 ft tall with proportions that were subtly wrong in ways that made it uncomfortable to look at directly. The entity did not speak, but it somehow communicated that I was being tested to determine humanity's readiness for contact with technologies and forms of existence that were beyond current human understanding. My modern survival equipment had been modified to serve as interfaces for this testing, allowing the entities to observe how I would react to phenomena that challenged my assumptions about reality and technology. The entity indicated that I was free to leave, but that my equipment would continue to function differently than it had before, occasionally providing glimpses of the larger reality that existed alongside the normal human world. When I finally found my way back to civilization 2 weeks later, I discovered that my satellite phone had been transmitting my location accurately the entire time, according to my support team in California. From their perspective, I had simply been camping in the predetermined location and had maintained regular contact throughout my stay in the mountains. But my equipment still sometimes shows me things that should not exist, and I now understand that human technology is far more primitive than we realize.